My research explored the role of worst-case scenarios in bushfire decision-making. Worst-case scenarios are high-consequence events that are rare, so they're difficult for decision-makers to consider because they don't have the experience base of such events. Managing worst-case scenarios has got two elements. The first is you've got to imagine the worst-case scenario, and the second is take some action to prepare for that event happening. A good example of managing a worst-case scenario is defensive driving. So if you've ever coasted through an intersection with your foot on the brake, in case a car turns incorrectly in front of you, then you've practiced worst-case scenario thinking and managing such an event. My research involved 3 studies that interviewed bushfire fighters. I won't go into the details of those studies here, but you can refer to my fire note at the Bushfire CRC website, where there are details of the methods and the results of my studies. But basically, overall, bushfire fighters considered worst-case scenarios, but it was inconsistent. So some firefighters considered them a lot, regularly, and others identified worst-case scenarios but didn't always necessarily act on them, whereas others didn't consider worst-case scenarios at all. I identified a number of barriers to worst-case scenario thinking, and they were barriers to the identification element and also to the preparing for worst-case scenarios. Those barriers included a lack of appropriate experience. That was the most common barrier, and very important for firefighting decision-making. Some of the other barriers included tunnel vision, so concentrating just on the current situation without thinking about the future. Interpersonal factors influenced worst-case scenario thinking, as well as underestimating risk and underestimating time and space. In one of my studies, I talked to a lot of highly experienced bushfire fighters, particularly involved in incident management. Now, these people told me about how important thinking about worst-case scenarios is, and they also discussed some of the barriers that I mentioned. These experts seem to have ways, strategies and behaviours of managing those barriers, so they minimised the barriers and were better able to think about worst-case scenarios. Some of these strategies included what-if thinking, so they questioned how the situation could deteriorate, how things could go badly, and put actions into place to manage those. Another one was backup plans, so experts knew that they needed more than just a single plan. They needed to be able to deal with the situation in a number of ways and have contingency plans. That was important. Another way that experts made sure they considered worst-case scenarios was by critiquing plans. They encouraged others around them to check their assumptions, to discuss any comments that they had, any worries that people had, and they really tried to include other people in their decision-making process. And also, experts understood the importance of learning, reviewing their own behaviours, debriefing, identifying how they had performed well and the areas that they needed to improve. I believe these strategies and behaviours can really help to improve worst-case scenario thinking for all decision makers in bushfire fighting. That is, bring everybody up to a consistent level of thinking about worst-case scenarios.